Have you ever stopped to think about how different the weather feels compared to a few years ago? Well, you're not imagining across the whole world, people are noticing these changes in their daily life, and yet, despite all the science evidence, climate change is still questioned or misunderstood by some people. Hello, and welcome to Think Before You Believe, a podcast where global issues are explored and common myths are questioned. I'm Kevin, and today we're talking about the climate change. To explore this topic, I am joined by four professional panelists in the field. Joan will guide us through some of the most common climate myths. Gina will help us take a look into climate change and how it's commonly communicated in society. Giselle will bring the science perspective, helping us to understand the environmental change and how are they seen today. And Gabriela will connect this discussion with education, exploring how the schools can help develop environmental awareness and critical thinking. So let's start with the conversation. For a start to unpacking this topic for the first part of the discussion, we'll be joined by Gisette and Johan, science and public perception. So, with the first question, people often say that climate change is an invisible threat, but today environmental change are being noticed in daily life and around the whole world. So, from your experience, what environmental changes have you noticed in your hometowns, and how are they affecting your daily life?
Well, I live in my whole life, so I've been able to notice how the climate has changed over the years. Neighbor has always been a hot city, but now daily life is being affected more. For example, people who work outdoors, like construction workers or street vendors. During the hottest hours of the day, headaches, dehydration, and fatigue are becoming more common.
Right, you said, but from a scientific point of view, what's behind these extreme temperatures?
Well, in simple terms, the Earth average temperature has been rising due to greenhouse gases produced by human activities like burning fossil fuels. As the planet warms, extreme heat becomes strong, and that's why what people feel locally is often connected to a much bigger global process.
Right, that sounds pretty much interesting. Even when people notice these changes, the explanation they hear are not always based on science. So, Johan, since you have a study, climate myths and public belief, how does people usually explain these changes?
I agree with you and the things you said described. Yes, but they actually happen quite often. No, the people can be clearly feel that something is changing. No, we know. They notice that the heat and usually raining. No, and or the reason does not feel the same as the before, but the explanation they hear about those changes can be very different. It's so very important to know this, guys. But for example, on other ways, and common ideas is that the climate change are not just a part for a natural cycle of the earth. We know this, and then, that the humans aren't really responsible for it. Or another myth of the people often repeat. Now is that science don't actually agree about climate change. So finally, so what's end up on happening is that the people are experienced for real environment change. And this is my question.
Yes, exactly. And that's a really important point. In the scientific community, there is actually a very strong argument about climate change and what is causing it. The problem is that scientific information doesn't always reach people clearly, and when explanation are missing, myths can spread more easily.
All right, so basically, in a way, when people don't have clear information, myths can kind of fill that gap.
Yes, that's right, Kevin. Yeah, the question and something those myths spread because they sound simple initially. For my opinion, sometimes means saying, well, it's so cool today. Now, by the way, global warming can be real. It's so be real. But what's where the confusion come in? because the climate and the weather are not the same things. We know this. Finally, the weather can change one day or the next. It's so very different. And climate, to the other hand, describe patterns and they happen over many years.
Right. So basically, the discussion is really important. People are noticing real changes in their environment, but the explanation they hear don't always much have science information. So now, on another question that often comes up in these discussions, a large part of global pollution comes from industries and big corporations. So when people hear that, they sometimes wonder, do individual actions really make a difference? So, Gisette, from my science perspective, how should we understand this balance?
Thanks, Kevin. From a scientific perspective, climate change depends on the total amount of emission in the atmosphere. So every reduction helps lower the impact, and when many people adopt sustainable habits, like reducing water or consuming less energy, and can also influence public demand and encourage governments and campaigns to act.
All right, so somehow these actions add up and influence bigger systems, but does focusing on individuals distract from the bigger role of industry?
Yes, I agree with you in other ways, but yes, that's actually where mass information sometimes appears now, but exactly what is also where mass information can appear. When the people hear that industries produce most emission, some conclude that individual action don't matter at all. But the idea can be easily turned off a myth, so very important. And other myths still circulate too. For example, we know some people say is so sowing somewhere, then global warming can be happening.
All right, so that's something people mention quite often. What do you think, Gisette?
Exactly, but remember, and speaking of the example that Joan gave us, climates and weather are not the same thing. Weather describe short-term conditions like a cold day, rain, or storms. Climate, on the other hand, refers to patterns that happen over many years. And going back to the question of responsibility, it's important to remember that both levels, systemic action in individual behavior, are part of the solution.
Great. Thank you both for the insights that you have shared this time. So, moving on, we also need to think about how people learn to question information and recognize misinformation in these kind of situations. So, for the next discussion, we will bring Gabriela and Gina. Basically, the first question in this part will be: in many countries, environmental and science is considered a core subject from any early age. However, in our context, climate change is often treated as a secondary topic in school. So, Gabriela, welcome. And let me start with you by asking you, do you think the importance of this crisis has been underestimated by the education system?
Well, thank you, Kevin. That's a really, really interesting question. Well, to be honest, I think the importance of climate change is sometimes underestimated in today's education. I've seen that in many schools, it's only mentioned briefly, usually in science classes or maybe in subjects like geography. But it's really important to remember that climate change affects many aspects of our lives, sorry. And it's not only an environmental issue, but it also affects our society and our own future. So, for that reason, I really believe it shouldn't be limited to just one subject. Climate change also affects social and economic aspects, so it should be discussed across different areas of learning. So students can explore the topic from different perspectives and not only from a scientific point of view. And as someone who is a teacher like me, I think education shouldn't only give students information, like almost like throwing paper into the air and expecting them to make sense of it. Instead, education should help them understand the world they live in and reflect on their own role in it. And actually, I think the most important part here is the critical thinking. Today, in the world we live in, we are constantly exposed to information from many different places. So students learn how to question what they read, analyze resources, and think about the consequences of human actions. They become much better prepared to understand complex issues like climate change is, and to make responsible, prepared to understand decisions and their own world.
All right, that's really interesting, and I pretty much agree with you because it suggests that education isn't just about learning facts, but about learning how to think about these complex issues. So now, moving from a perspective more of a public communication, Gina, why do you think misinformation about climate change is spread out so easily, especially on social media?
Well, thank you, Kevin. I'm glad to join the conversation. Well, one important reason is that today people receive information from many different sources, especially from social media. This information may look convincing, but it isn't always based on scientific evidence. Then people see the same message repeatedly online and may start to accept it as true without really questioning it. Sometimes the language used to describe climate change sounds softer or less urgent, which can make the problem seem less serious than it actually is. The way a message is framed can influence how people understand reality. This is key for deniers who manipulate the message. The usual suspects around climate change denial are oil and gas companies. Thousands and probably $1 million have been spent on lobbying at many levels, from news to legislative power. As a direct consequence, we can see particular interests continue to prevail over the greater good. And this is how, in the post truth era, as it is called, people tend to believe what algorithm dictates them, since fake news are known to generate more traffic and views. That's why communication plays such an important role. Clear and responsible communication can help people better understand the urgency of the issue and make more informed decisions.
All right, so somehow, in other words, it's not only about having information available, but about how that information is communicated and interpreted by the public. Pretty much agree with that. So, Gabriela, from an educational perspective, how can school help students develop that critical thinking when facing information online? What can you say about this?
I think schools play a really important role here, especially because, like Dina said before, students today grow up surrounded by information from the internet and the social media. And again, like I mentioned it earlier, education shouldn't focus only on giving information to the students, but also on teaching them how to question and analyze what they read or what they watch on the internet. So if we, it's important to know that if we really want to a better future, it's essential to help students develop those skills and make them one of the most important goals in the education, like teachers.
All right, what do you think about this, Gina?
Well, I would like to add a point from this communication perspective, because I believe another important aspect is how scientific information is presented to the public. Many climate studies are written in very technical language, which can make them difficult for non-experts to understand. That's why journalists and communicators play such an important role in translating that information into clear and accessible messages. For instance, for students, they could understand better the message too. It's also useful to use an appropriate approach to teach, not using a confrontational strategy, but finding common grounds, listening others' points of view, and personalizing the message according on interlocutors' values and principles. And finally, communication shouldn't focus only on the risks of climate change, but also on possible solutions. When people see examples of actions taken by communities or by governments, the issue becomes more relatable and less abstract.
Pretty much agree with that. Thank you very much, Gina. So making the information clearer can really change how people see the issue. So thank you both for participating and for the insight that you have shared. So moving on to the conclusion of this podcast, As you could hear, it's clear that this isn't just about numbers or weather reports. The situation is defined by how these changes are experienced and how the information is interpreted and how responsibility is shared by all of us, both as individual and as a society. So that will be all from our side. We really hope that today's discussion leaves you thinking, asking questions, and reflecting on how the role that each other must play in society. A huge thank you to Giselle, Joanne, Gabriela, and Gina for sharing their thoughts and insights, and to the listeners for joining today's topic. Until the next time, this was Think Before You Believe. Thank you very much.